Okay, so continuing here, we've been talking about, generally speaking, sexual activity, sexual behavior for teenagers, emerging adults, and generally talking about really what do we know about that between sexual activity between males and females. Obviously, that's not the whole picture. That there is much more diversity. There is uh, teenagers who are not attracted to the opposite sex, who are experiencing attraction to members of the same sex, who are experiencing attraction to both sexes, are experimenting with perhaps activities in various activities with different partners. And then there's transgender adolescents who feel that their biological sex doesn't match their identity. And we know that same sex attractions are way higher than same sex behavior or LGBT identification. And I think as we move forward with more awareness and more tolerance and more openness around the variety of sexual attractions and sexual behavior, I think we're coming much more to understand that this duality that exists between opposite sex attraction is really one piece of the continuum of sexual experience and sexual identity and sexual behavior. That there's much more of a continuum, there's much more variety that we all experience, and that if there was more openness about it, ability to talk about it, there'd be much more reported. And that's probably always been true. Um, but we have obviously all our cultural expectations, which are influenced obviously by biology and evolution and the need for reproduction and sort of protecting that as a very important part of human existence and all life existence. Anyway, I think that's I think there's a lot more variety that actually exists in terms of attraction and sexual activity that will be coming out more so. Anyway, though, the teenage years, very important time for sexual exploration, sexual identity, and certainly for teenagers who experience themselves on that continuum of same-sex attraction or transgender or bisexual attraction. This is equally important and can be a little more difficult, a little more challenging because of um, stigma and lack of tolerance associated with anything outside the norm of opposite attraction. There's a process to coming out. Typically, that awareness begins in early adolescence of feeling different. I think that we're going to find that actually that awareness goes much earlier than early adolescence. Um, but, you know, currently what we know for sure is typically that awareness occurs early adolescence. The average age of coming out has dropped from 21 in the 1970s to about 16 currently, and I would predict that it will continue to drop with a more open society. Typically, teenagers come out first to their friends. Fewer than 10% report telling a parent first. And the process of coming out typically is longer and later for African Americans and Latinos. And this is definitely associated with much more conservative attitudes about same sex um, attraction and stigma against that. Homophobia is a fear and hatred of homosexuals, and of course, this can play a role depending on what your cultural context is and what is the degree of homophobia within that cultural context for how you deal with your own awareness of being, quote unquote, different from the norm. And again, depending on that context, it can be traumatic for a teenager to be coming to awareness that I'm attracted to boys, I'm attracted to girls, same sex, or I'm transgender in some way, can be very traumatic. Approval and or rejection from parents is a very, very important factor for teenagers in terms of their experience, their awareness, their coming out. Rejection from parents is associated with higher rates of attempted suicide, 8 times what is normal. For depression, 6 times higher than those who receive some acceptance, support from parents. Drug use, 3 times. Unprotected sex, 3 times. Those teens who are rejected, greater risk for drug use, unprotected sex, 3 times the norm. And this is also associated with homelessness that we talked about. When teenagers are rejected by their parents when they come out, or their parents become aware of their homosexuality or their transgender identity, parents can literally disown them, kick them out in some way, or make staying at home intolerable. And of course, being homeless has all sorts of other risks associated with it. And then mistreatment from peers also happens. 82% of teenagers who identify as LGBT or don't identify actively are subject to verbal abuse, and 34% are subject to some kind of physical harassment. So it's not an easy road, and certainly hasn't been in the past, and hopefully is getting better. The internet is becoming, or has been at least, and continues to be a way to explore and understand sexuality for LGBT teenagers by allowing them to be more open, to make connections with others who are LGBT in an environment that feels safe and controlled to some extent. And sadly, the internet can also be a place where they're bullied. And, I think we had a very sad situation where a young boy who was gay was found out to be gay, and then it was all over the internet, and committed suicide. So it goes both ways. But generally speaking, it's been a positive for LGBT teenagers. And then definitely our attitudes towards LGBT teens is becoming much more tolerant towards homosexuality and different sexuality, more tolerant and favorable. And definitely adolescents and emerging adults themselves are a demographic that are much more tolerant and favorable of this kind of diversity. 70% report accepting gay marriage. 70% of teenagers and emerging adults report accepting gay marriage, for example, as compared to only 39% of elderly Americans. Many high schools are developing gay-straight alliances, or having clubs, or having activities, educational kinds of things, trying to really create a safe environment for LGBT teenagers. And It Gets Better project is a project put out by parents to support tolerance and creating a safe environment for LGBT. And they have a pledge to encourage LGBT adolescents or to encourage LGBT adolescents and have teenagers take this pledge. Everyone deserves to be respected for who they are. I pledge to spread this message to my friends, family, and neighbors. I'll speak up against hate and intolerance whenever I see it, at school and at work. I'll provide hope for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and other bullied teens by letting them know that it gets better. Okay, so I think that's all very, very important differences. This is just a chart that shows you how acceptance has grown towards same-sex marriage by generation. This is 1928, 1945. In 2001, barely above 21%, have moved upwards 2015 to 39%. And you can see here the millennials were already in 2003 at 51% of them having a positive attitude favoring same-sex marriage, and they're up to 70%. So definitely our society is changing for the better. Last two things here that I want to talk about are sexual harassment, sexual coercion. Two things that teens can be victims of, are victims of, certainly growing awareness of this in our society, and definitely a consequence of some of scripts around gender roles. Sexual harassment is any wide range of threatening or aggressive behavior related to sexuality, from mild harassment, name-calling, jokes, leering kinds of looks, stares, to severe sexual harassment, unwanted touching, or sexual contact. Very high in adolescence. 20% of males report being sexually harassed in some way. Think LGBT, probably a greater number of males for this, and 25 to 70% of females. Wide range here, and I would say is probably related to how safe females feel coming out about being sexually harassed, and also recognizing, going back to those gender roles, is this actually harassment? Here's LGBT, early maturing girls, targeted much higher rates. Early maturing girls, this can add to that confusion and stress for being an early maturing girl. And then sexual and romantic joking, teasing is very common, so sometimes it's hard to identify, is this just harmless, normal kind of teasing, or is it actually harassment of some sort? And I think growing awareness of this is going to be important. And then really, what is the experience of the person? If you feel harassed in some way or unsafe or threatened, it's harassment, whether the other person is intending that or not. And I think much more awareness needs to be out there about that. And then sexual coercion, the last piece here, is any kind of act of sexual aggression in which a person, typically a woman, but not always, is forced by a romantic partner, date, or acquaintance to have sexual relationships against her will. I would say against his will as well, because this can happen obviously in same-sex relationships. And sometimes women can be coercive as well. Typically associated with verbal pressure, alcohol or drugs again, we talked about this with emerging adults, or physical force. 1/3 of males and almost half of girls report some kind of sexual coercion. And interestingly enough, again, back to those gender roles and identity, there are very different views about sexual coercion and sexual harassment, I would say, between males and females. Males tend to view a woman showing interest in them, a woman flirting with them, a woman being dressed in a sexy way, if you will, being affectionate towards them, as I mentioned, as some kind of consent, that if a woman is behaving this way, it means she's okay with sex. She's inviting me to have sex with her. That's how they interpret, and remember, their interpretation of that behavior comes from those sexual and dating scripts related to gender roles, and women don't see it that way. They don't see that how they dress or their flirting behavior as an invitation, and they view men's behavior, any of these kinds of pressure and physical force, as coercive.